If someone asked you to describe the Lord of the Rings trilogy with a single word or phrase, what would you say? Well, this was the exact question researchers at Aberystwyth University posed to over 25,000 Lord of the Rings viewers in what remains the largest survey of its global audience to date. You see, these academics were interested in getting to the core of a simple and yet mystifying question that I'm also fascinated by. Why was the series able to achieve such widespread, worldwide mainstream appeal? What about its narrative, contemporary and overall presentation resonated so heavily with audiences across different cultures and nations that they decided to bless it with more money than Eru Iluvatar himself could create? Well, the answer they got might just surprise you. You see, out of a series of descriptive and genre terms, those who also rated their enjoyment the highest were disproportionately likely to choose the term spiritual journey to describe the trilogy. Not fantasy or even epic, but spiritual journey. Now, this might sound like a strange way to describe the highest of high fantasy, a series full of genre tropes from magical wizards to dwarfs, orcs, demons, that revolves around an all-powerful magical ring and a large glowing eye. But as this survey demonstrates, only by looking beyond the trilogy's superficial fantasy coating can we truly begin to understand why it managed to do what no other high fantasy has done to date: dominate the cinematic mainstream. So you might be asking, what is a high fantasy? Why has it historically struggled to break into the mainstream? And what is so different about Lord of the Rings? High fantasy, a term coined by the author Lloyd Alexander in a 1971 essay, describes a type of fantasy narrative that takes place in a world that plays by radically different rules to our own, and is usually dominated by the classic tropes of dwarves, elves, and so on and so forth. This is in contrast to a low fantasy setting, where all of these tropes exist, but within a world that is far more familiar than not. Just think of Harry Potter or Good Omens. In other words, while low fantasy is distinguished by its accessibility, high fantasy is by its inaccessibility and creativity. Audiences are expected to commit a degree of focus to uncovering the most basic details of its world through exposition, dialogue, and obscure details. This high barrier of entry are one of the major reasons why it's always been naturally more difficult for high fantasy stories to penetrate the mainstream in the same way as its low fantasy cousins.
No, that's not an opinion, it's a fact.
A good example of high versus low would be The Wheel of Time versus Game of Thrones. The TV series, based on George R.R. Martin's book series, might inevitably build up to a magical clash between walkers, fire priests, and dragons, but for the most part, episodes focus on deeply relatable character drama within a world that resembles our own past more than a fantasy reality, and is principally concerned not with dragons, but with what George R.R. Martin refers to as the only thing worth writing about: the human heart in conflict with itself. The Wheel of Time, by contrast, exists in a world so different to our own that its narrative is dragged down by the weight of its own jargon.
As the High Lord commands.
You disobeyed an order. You invaded a village without permission.
But I've brought back an Ogier slave, a Shinarn lord.
It will be unnatural to have characters start explaining terms that they are already aware of, so audiences are forced to pick up the pieces themselves. And while for a fantasy fan like myself, this is the fun part, uncovering the secrets of an elaborate fantasy world is my idea of a great time, but for the majority of people, your average viewer, it's simply too much. So how does a world so steeped in magic and tropes as The Lord of the Rings manage to avoid this key limitation? Well, it completely flips the logic of high fantasy. Rather than using a fantasy setting to explore the possibilities of an alternative universe with magical laws of physics, Tolkien instead uses Middle-earth as the aesthetic backdrop for a romance that taps into far more universal themes. Now, by romance, I'm not talking about a classic girl meets boy Hollywood plot, but a distinctly evocative style of storytelling with its origins in the 19th century Romantic movement. Romanticism is an artistic movement that emerged as a reaction to the environmental devastation brought about by the Industrial Revolution. It was defined by, as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy puts it, a commitment to the idea that the character of art and beauty and of our engagement with them should shape all aspects of human life, and a reverence of aesthetic beauty. In the case of Romantics, specifically the beauty contained within the harmony between the natural world and humanity. Now, if you haven't picked up yet already, this almost describes the Lord of the Rings books, and by extension Peter Jackson's thematically faithful adaptation, to a T. The central narrative conflict in Lord of the Rings is not just between good and evil, but between aesthetic beauty and its opposite. Saruman and Sauron's armies are full of ugly, depraved creatures, and their spread brings about devastation to the natural beauty of the environment. And those who fall under the influence of Sauron or the Ring, like Gollum and the King of the Rohirrim, suffer rot in body as well as in mind. And on the flip side, all of the moral, noble, and good races embody the romantic aesthetic ideal. The elves literally glow with beauty and live in harmony with the environment in sustainable enclaves. And the hobbits, the race regarded by the Fellowship and many in Middle-earth as the purest and most unvarnished, not only live harmoniously with the environment, but, as Tolkien himself stated, are most similar to him. Plus, if you understand The Lord of the Rings this way, it becomes extremely clear why Tolkien seemingly has zero interest in explaining his world and why no one cares. Search through the main trilogy of books, or especially films, for info on how magic works, why Sauron does that, who Gandalf even is, what species Aragorn is, and then ask your average person to answer these questions, and trust me, you'll end up with less useful information than a lobotomized brain. But on the whole, these flaws, contradictions, and unexplained everything have done so little to dampen our enjoyment, they're barely worth mentioning. Because Lord of the Rings at its core taps into an aesthetic and storytelling tradition that was tailor-fit for the 20th century. You see, much like the Romantics in the early age of industrialization, the early 2000s was a period of increasing uniformity and environmental destruction in the name of modernity we now refer to as globalization. After the Cold War, it was becoming increasingly accepted that the world was converging towards a single model of liberal democratic economic progress. Authors like Francis Fukuyama referred to it as the end of history. And to an extent, you can hardly blame him. This new age of globalization was transformative for the majority of the world that had not yet experienced economic progress. Just compare the poverty of a country like China before to the world of skyscrapers and high tech it was beginning to become by the release of The Lord of the Rings, and has now nearly completed. But for those already living in the relative comfort of the developed world, it was hard not to feel like something almost indescribable had been lost in this new world. A sense of beauty, creativity, and art. Now everything, even the buildings, were a shade of grey. And so it's no surprise that when Lord of the Rings popped up, with its vision of an age defined by gallant, beautiful heroes opposing a great evil to create a society in harmony with the natural beauty of the environment, appealed to a modern society that had abandoned simplicity, purity, and beauty in the name of progress. And this is where the spiritual label comes in. Because this yearning for a black and white vision of unvarnished beauty and good to contrast evil and corruption is as fundamental to our humanity as anything. It's powered religious narratives of purity and decline for thousands of years, from the ancient dichotomy of truth versus lies in Zoroastrianism to biblical narratives of Babylon's collapse. And Lord of the Rings is a successor to these type of stories. In fact, the more cynical and hopeless a society becomes, the more we need such a romantic ideal to cling onto. The Lord of the Rings itself came out of such circumstances. Tolkien was no armchair idealist, but a veteran of the First World War, a man who had seen the very worst of humanity up front in the trenches. And perhaps it's not a surprise that viewers outside of the, at least at the time, highly optimistic American culture were most drawn towards the spiritual reading of the films. In fact, as Giselle de Culpas and Jérôme Declote notes referring to the 25,000 person survey, viewers living outside the Anglo-Saxon world seem to resist dominant readings of the trilogy as a fantasy or even epic. In the example of Spain specifically, José Javier Sánchez Aranda, Josiba Banuat, and Maria del Mar Grando note that many Spanish viewers dream about being a powerful person and embarking upon an enormous quest, but what also appeals to them is the idea of an ideal life full of good and close at hand virtues. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and if you're interested in a part 2 where I contrast the Peter Jackson trilogy with the Rings of Power, let me know in the comments.